A young boy once stumbled across a damaged robot buried among piles of scrap metal and assumed it was nothing more than junk. What he didn't know was that this forgotten machine would eventually reveal abilities far beyond anything he imagined. In the near future, the sport of boxing has changed dramatically. Audiences gradually lost interest in watching human fighters exchange punches. The violence wasn't intense enough anymore, and ticket sales began to collapse. To bring excitement back, massive robot warriors took over the ring. Controlled by humans, these steel fighters now battle in brutal arenas while crowds cheer from the stands. Charlie Kenton used to be a boxer himself before the sport changed. Now he makes a living traveling from one town to another, entering robot fights in hopes of earning quick cash. Unfortunately, luck rarely seems to be on his side, and defeat follows him almost everywhere he goes. After spending an entire night partying, Charlie wakes up inside his battered van. Empty beer bottles are scattered across the floor. Before he can fully clear his head, his phone rings. A creditor is calling to ask about the $30,000 Charlie still owes him. Trying to buy time, Charlie casually addresses the caller by the wrong name. The man immediately catches on and realizes he's just one of several people waiting to collect money from the former boxer. Thinking quickly, Charlie pretends the signal is breaking up and abruptly ends the call. A little later, a group of young girls approaches the van. They've heard about Charlie's robot, Ambush, and want to see it up close. One of them even pulls out a camera for a photo. Charlie, never missing an opportunity to make a few dollars, demands $5 for a picture. The kids take one look at the worn-out machine and decide it's not worth paying for. Disappointed, they walk away. Soon afterward, Charlie arrives at a local fairground and meets Ricky, an old acquaintance who manages the arena. Ricky offers him $3,000 if Ambush agrees to participate in a special event, a fight against one of the arena's bulls. The problem becomes obvious almost immediately. Charlie was expecting an animal weighing around 800 pounds. Instead, the bull standing before him is nearly twice that size. Despite the huge disadvantage, Charlie's confidence gets the better of him. Certain that Ambush can somehow pull off the impossible, he proposes an additional wager. If Ambush wins, Ricky will owe him $20,000. Ricky laughs but accepts. At the same time, he reminds Charlie that another loss would only sink him deeper into debt. The event begins. With plenty of showmanship, Charlie introduces Ambush to the crowd like a champion entering a title fight. During the opening moments, things actually seem promising. Ambush moves surprisingly well and avoids several powerful attacks from the giant animal. Feeling victorious already, Charlie starts playing to the audience, soaking up their attention. That distraction proves costly. While Charlie is busy entertaining spectators, he completely misses the furious bull charging from behind. The animal slams directly into Ambush with devastating force. Metal twists and breaks as one of the robot's legs is ripped away. Seeing the disaster unfold, Charlie begs Ricky to stop the match. Ricky has no intention of helping. Instead, he watches with satisfaction as Charlie's hopes are crushed. By the time it's over, Ambush is nothing more than a pile of wrecked parts. Curious children quickly swarm the remains, tearing off pieces as souvenirs and leaving nothing of value behind. Now unable to pay what he owes, Charlie tries sneaking away before Ricky can find him. As he leaves, two men begin following him. Assuming they're debt collectors, Charlie immediately swings at one of them. The strangers quickly explain that they're not there for money at all. They bring devastating news. Charlie's former wife has passed away. Their 11-year-old son, Max, has been left without a parent. Surprisingly, Charlie shows very little concern. Rather than focusing on Max's future, he heads straight to court to give up his parental rights. Wealthy relatives from his ex-wife's side have expressed interest in taking the boy in permanently. Seeing an opportunity, Charlie negotiates. For $100,000, he agrees to transfer custody. An additional $50,000 is paid upfront under one condition. Max must spend the summer with his father first, giving them a chance to strengthen their relationship. The moment the money reaches his hands, Charlie spends a large portion of it on a new robot, not just any robot. He purchases Noisy Boy, a famous high-end fighter equipped with advanced voice control technology. Since acquiring one legally would be impossible, Charlie obtains it through black market connections. Afterward, he returns to the gym he currently calls home. The building belongs to Bailey Tallet, daughter of Charlie's late trainer. She's already frustrated because Charlie owes months of unpaid rent. When she sees the expensive robot he just bought, her frustration only grows. Charlie tries charming his way out of the argument, but Bailey isn't interested in flirtation. Bills need to be paid, and excuses won't help. Their conversation is interrupted when Max arrives with the relatives. The boy isn't upset because Charlie sold custody rights. Instead, he's annoyed that his father didn't cut him in on the deal. Charlie casually explains that nearly all the money has already gone toward purchasing the robot. If Max doesn't like it, he's free to leave. Rather than arguing, Max decides to stay and watch the unboxing. Moments later, Noisy Boy emerges from his shipping crate. Dressed in impressive samurai-style armor, the robot looks far more advanced than anything Charlie has ever owned. Everyone in the room pauses to admire the machine. Excited to test his investment, Charlie immediately starts issuing combat commands. Nothing happens. Noisy Boy remains completely motionless. Convinced he's been cheated, Charlie explodes in frustration and starts blaming Bailey for not inspecting the robot properly. Then Max notices something the adults overlooked. The robot was built in Japan. Instead of repeating the commands in English, Max speaks them in Japanese. Instantly, Noisy Boy responds. Bailey quickly realizes the solution. The robot simply needs its voice settings adjusted. With the problem solved, Charlie takes Noisy Boy for a brief test run before loading him into the van. His next destination is another competition where he hopes to finally turn his luck around. Before he can leave, Max secretly takes the vehicle keys. He makes a simple demand. Either Charlie takes him along for the trip, or the van isn't going anywhere. Having little choice, Charlie reluctantly agrees. Together they travel to an underground robot fighting venue packed with machines of every shape and size. The atmosphere is chaotic, loud, and full of competitors eager to prove themselves. Charlie walks in overflowing with confidence. Convinced that Noisy Boy is his ticket back to success, he immediately approaches the event organizer, Finn, and requests a spot in the night's headline match. Max thinks that's a terrible idea. He reminds his father that Noisy Boy has never fought a real battle under their control. A few warm-up matches would be the safer option. Charlie ignores the warning. Certain that his new robot is unbeatable, he enters Noisy Boy directly against the club's biggest attraction and reigning superstar fighter, Midas. As the fight gets underway, Noisy Boy immediately lives up to his reputation. The armored robot charges forward and lands several crushing attacks that send the crowd into a frenzy. Every successful strike is met with cheers and excitement from the spectators. For a brief moment, it looks like Charlie's gamble has finally paid off. Noisy Boy dominates the opening exchanges, and Charlie can already imagine the prize money in his pocket. Certain that victory is only minutes away, he becomes careless. That confidence quickly comes back to haunt him. While celebrating too early, Charlie completely misses a critical move from Midas. The champion seizes the opportunity and shifts the momentum of the match in an instant. Suddenly, Noisy Boy is the one being pushed backward. Panicking, Charlie realizes he barely knows how to operate his expensive new robot. Instead of using proper commands, he starts shouting random phrases that simply sound impressive, hoping something will work. His opponent, however, knows every detail of Midas's capabilities. The difference in preparation soon becomes painfully obvious. After a relentless assault, Midas delivers a devastating blow that tears Noisy Boy's head clean off. The crowd erupts while Charlie watches his investment collapse before his eyes. When the destruction is over, almost nothing remains functional except the robot's voice control system. Max is furious. He points out the obvious. Entering a championship fight without even learning the robot's basic controls was unbelievably reckless. Charlie refuses to admit he was wrong. Instead, he snaps at his son and warns him to keep quiet if he wants a roof over his head for the night instead of sleeping outside. The long drive home is tense and silent. Along the way, they stop at a massive scrapyard in hopes of finding spare parts that could help Charlie get back into the fighting business. While searching through mountains of discarded machinery, Charlie tells Max about the history of robot boxing. He explains how human fighters gradually disappeared from the sport and how machines eventually took over the ring completely. As Max listens to the story, he isn't paying attention to where he's walking. Without warning, the ground disappears beneath his feet. The boy slips over the edge of a steep drop. For a terrifying moment, it seems he's about to fall to his death. Luckily, his hand catches onto something solid. Hanging from the side of the cliff is the arm of an old robot buried beneath years of dirt and debris. Charlie immediately rushes down to help. He reaches Max, pulls him to safety, and for a brief moment forgets all his usual selfishness. Holding the terrified boy tightly, he makes sure his son is unharmed. Once he calms down, Max becomes curious about what saved him. Looking closer, he discovers an entire robot hidden beneath the soil. Excited by the find, Max asks Charlie to bring over a cart so they can haul the machine back. Unfortunately, Charlie quickly returns to his usual attitude. He refuses to help and leaves the task entirely to his son. Determined not to give up, Max spends the entire night dragging the heavy robot piece by piece up the steep hill. Hour after hour, he struggles through exhaustion. By sunrise, he finally manages to pull the machine all the way back to the van. Together, they return to the gym. When Bailey sees what remains of Noisy Boy, she is horrified. The expensive robot has been reduced to little more than scrap metal. Disappointed, she confronts Charlie and warns him that his obsession with chasing impossible victories will eventually cost him everything that still matters in his life. Charlie begs for one more favor. He asks Bailey to inspect the old robot Max recovered from the junkyard. After running several checks, Bailey uncovers some surprising information. The machine isn't a combat robot at all. It's an outdated model originally designed as a sparring partner. Unlike professional fighters, it wasn't built to deliver powerful attacks. Its purpose was entirely different. The robot was created to absorb punishment and help others train. Even more surprisingly, the machine still works. As the systems begin coming online, Bailey notices a rare function hidden within its programming. The robot possesses a shadow feature. This allows it to perfectly copy and mirror human movements in real time. Meanwhile, Max starts cleaning away years of mud and rust from the machine's body. While examining the faded markings, he discovers its name, Adam. Inspired by the discovery, Max proposes using Adam in underground robot fights to earn some money. Later that night, after everyone has gone to sleep, the boy quietly sneaks into the gym. He powers Adam on and takes the robot outside. Under the night sky, Max spends hours learning how to control a robot for the very first time. Together, they wander through the empty streets as he experiments with commands and movement. The experience only strengthens the bond beginning to form between the boy and the forgotten machine. The following morning, Max becomes curious about his father. While Charlie is busy elsewhere, he asks Bailey what Charlie was like before robots took over boxing. Bailey's face lights up as she begins telling stories. She describes Charlie as a fearless fighter who never backed down, no matter how tough the opponent standing across from him was. He always kept fighting until the very end. According to Bailey, Charlie possessed the heart of a true boxer. The problem was timing. Just as he was chasing his dream of becoming champion, the world changed. Robot boxing arrived, and the skills that once made Charlie special suddenly had far less value. Before Bailey can continue, Charlie walks in and ends the conversation. He announces that they're heading to Atlanta. His plan is to meet potential investors who might help finance another robot. After arriving in the city, Charlie leaves Max in the lobby of a large building while he goes searching for Finn. While waiting, Max encounters a famous figure in the robot boxing world. The man is Tak Mashido, the brilliant creator behind Zeus, the undefeated champion robot feared across the entire sport. Surrounded by reporters, Mashido confidently boasts that no machine currently exists that can challenge Zeus inside the ring. According to him, any opponent daring to step forward will be completely destroyed. Elsewhere in the building, Charlie meets Finn and asks him for financial help. He hopes their friendship will convince Finn to lend him some money. It doesn't. Finn refuses to risk a single dollar on Charlie's latest scheme. The rejection leaves Charlie frustrated and irritated. To prove a point to Max, he finally agrees to let the boy enter Adam into a local fight. Secretly, Charlie believes the experience will end in failure and convince Max to stop bothering him about the robot. The next morning, Charlie wakes up to an unexpected sight. Max has already been training with Adam for hours. The robot is now spotless, fully cleaned, and operating far better than before. Using the shadow function, Max has even programmed several commands himself. For the first time in a long while, Charlie is genuinely impressed. Watching his son's determination, he can't help noticing a familiar stubbornness. It's the same trait he once saw in himself. Soon afterward, they travel to the location of the match. Before the fight begins, Max negotiates directly with the event organizer. His offer is simple. If Adam survives a single round, Max will earn $1,000. But if the robot fails and gets destroyed, the organizer gets to keep Adam. The wager is accepted. Moments later, the battle begins. Max takes control from the operator's station as Adam steps into the arena. Unlike most robots, Adam doesn't charge forward looking for a knockout. Instead, he focuses entirely on defense. The old machine absorbs punch after punch, calmly enduring everything the opposing robot throws at him while refusing to go down. Seeing Adam absorb hit after hit, Charlie starts shouting advice from ringside. He tells Max to keep the robot moving instead of standing still and letting the opponent dictate the fight. For a moment, it seems like the strategy might work. Then, everything goes wrong. The opposing robot suddenly grabs Adam, lifts him off balance, and smashes him with a powerful strike to the head. Adam crashes onto the arena floor. Immediately, the referee begins the countdown. The round is nearly over, and Adam has only 30 seconds to get back on his feet. As the seconds tick away, Max desperately orders Adam to stand. To everyone's surprise, the old robot responds. Slowly but surely, Adam rises before the count reaches 0. That single act is enough. Since Adam survived the round, Max officially wins the $1,000 wager. The organizer is clearly unhappy with the outcome. He was expecting an easy victory, not a stubborn robot refusing to stay down. Determined to recover his money, he offers a new challenge. If Adam survives one more round, he'll double the prize. This time, Charlie is the one trying to talk Max out of it. The risk is higher now, and Adam has already taken serious damage. But Max doesn't hesitate. He accepts. The second round begins. The crowd expects another defensive performance. Instead, Adam shocks everyone. The moment an opening appears, he leaps forward and lands a crushing punch directly on his opponent. The impact is so powerful that the rival robot systems instantly fail. Within seconds, the match is over. The audience erupts with cheers as Max proudly collects his winnings. For the first time, Adam has proven that he's capable of far more than simply taking punishment. The following day, Max continues working with the robot. He spends hours practicing commands and experimenting with Adam's capabilities. Eventually, the training becomes repetitive, and the boy starts fooling around. He begins dancing. To his amazement, Adam perfectly copies every move thanks to the shadow function. The robot mirrors each step, spin, and gesture with flawless precision. At that moment, Charlie walks in. Excitedly, Max explains that he transferred Noisy Boy's voice control system into Adam. Thanks to that upgrade, they no longer need the bulky control equipment. Then, he makes another request. He wants Charlie to teach Adam how to box using the shadow feature. At first, Charlie isn't interested. He jokingly suggests that dancing should become Adam's signature talent instead. Max agrees, but only under one condition. Charlie has to train Adam as a fighter. Eventually, Charlie gives in, and just like that, a new routine begins. Day after day, father and son work together. Charlie demonstrates boxing techniques while Adam carefully mirrors every movement. Max handles the robot's programming and operations, while Charlie focuses on teaching proper fighting skills. The training sessions stretch from morning until night. Whenever Adam enters a fight, Max introduces him with a crowd-pleasing dance performance. The unusual combination becomes a hit. Fight after fight, Adam keeps winning. At the same time, something even more important is happening. Charlie and Max are finally beginning to bond. The walls between them slowly disappear as they spend more time together. Their success in smaller competitions starts generating real income. Charlie even sends part of the earnings back to Bailey, paying off some of his debt along with extra money as a gesture of gratitude. Meanwhile, Adam's popularity explodes. Fans love the dancing robot. Videos of his matches spread quickly, and before long, people are talking about him everywhere. News outlets begin covering his unlikely rise through the ranks. Eventually, the attention becomes impossible to ignore. Thanks to Adam's growing fame, Charlie and Max receive an invitation to compete in the prestigious Real Steel Champions League tournament. It's the biggest opportunity they've ever had. As they prepare backstage for their next match, Max works on Adam's systems while Charlie tries to get him mentally ready. He reminds his son that emotions have no place inside the ring. Once the fight begins, focus is all that matters. A short time later, an assistant enters their workshop. The visitor informs them that someone important wishes to meet them. Charlie and Max are escorted to a private suite belonging to Farah Lemkova, the powerful owner of Zeus, the undefeated champion robot. Lemkova gets straight to the point. She explains that Zeus is looking for quality sparring partners and offers to purchase Adam for $200,000. The offer is only available until Adam's upcoming fight against Twin Cities. For Charlie, the decision seems obvious. $200,000 would solve countless problems. He immediately wants to accept. Max, however, refuses without hesitation. Angry and disappointed, he walks out of the room. Charlie follows him and tries convincing him that this is the smartest choice they'll ever get. But Max asks a simple question. Why would someone like Lemkova pay such a huge amount for an outdated robot? The boy believes there's something special about Adam, something others are starting to notice. As far as Max is concerned, Adam isn't for sale. Soon afterward, it's time for the next match. The arena shakes with excitement as Twin Cities makes its entrance. The robot's two-headed design immediately captures the crowd's attention. Moments later, Max leads Adam into the spotlight with another energetic dance routine. The fight begins. Right from the opening bell, Twin Cities overwhelms Adam with relentless attacks. Every attempt to counter is shut down before it can begin. Adam spends the first part of the fight trapped on the defensive. Watching closely, Charlie notices something unusual. Before every punch, Twin Cities' right shoulder makes a small involuntary movement. It's a tell, a weakness. Charlie quickly relays the information. Using the advice, Adam slips beneath incoming punches and starts targeting the opponent's body. Again and again, he attacks the vulnerable side. The strategy works. Twin Cities gradually slows down as the damage accumulates. Then comes the finishing moment. Adam launches a powerful kick that connects with one of the robot's heads and sends the giant crashing to the canvas. The arena explodes with applause. Fans leap to their feet cheering. Watching from afar, Bailey celebrates just as loudly. She can hardly believe how far Adam has come. Overcome with excitement, Max rushes into the ring. Before anyone can stop him, he grabs the referee's microphone. Standing before thousands of spectators, he boldly challenges Zeus to a future fight. The crowd roars even louder. After collecting their prize money, Charlie and Max head back toward their van. Unfortunately, their victory doesn't last long. Waiting for them outside is Ricky. Still angry over past debts, he arrives with several hired thugs. Without warning, the men attack. Charlie is beaten badly, and every dollar they earned is taken from them. Once the attackers leave, Charlie's thoughts immediately turn to Max's safety. Fearing that the violence could escalate, he decides to send the boy to stay with his legal guardians. Max is devastated. With tears filling his eyes, he begs his father to let him stay. But Charlie refuses. For the first time, his decision isn't motivated by selfishness. He's genuinely afraid that keeping Max nearby will put him in danger. Heartbroken, Max goes inside to pack his belongings. At the same time, Charlie rejects the remaining money he was supposed to receive from the custody arrangement. Later, he tries explaining himself to his son. Charlie admits that he doesn't see himself as someone worthy of being a father. In his eyes, Max deserves better. Before leaving, Max gives him one final message. He tells Charlie that he wishes his father would finally fight for something that truly matters. Afterward, Max departs with his relatives. Left alone, Charlie begins replaying every moment they've shared together. During the long journey home, memories of their adventures flood his mind. For the first time, he starts realizing just how much his son has come to mean to him. After dropping Max off, Charlie returns to the gym carrying the weight of everything that has happened. He finds Bailey there and, for the first time in a long while, allows himself to stop running from his problems. He sits beside her, and the simple gesture is enough to make her smile. The next morning, Bailey has a serious conversation with him. She tells Charlie that pushing Max away won't fix anything. According to her, the mistakes of the past don't have to define the future. She insists that there is still time to repair the bond between father and son if he's willing to fight for it. Her words finally break through. Charlie realizes she's right. The two share a kiss, and moments later he sets out to find Max. When they meet, Charlie speaks honestly for perhaps the first time in his life. He admits that he failed as a father and regrets all the years he spent absent from his son's life. Then he asks for something he never thought he would. A second chance. Charlie promises Max that this time he won't walk away. This time he'll stand and fight for him. As Max listens, Charlie steps aside. Standing behind him is Adam. The boy's face immediately lights up. Charlie reveals even bigger news. Zeus's team has officially accepted their challenge. He then convinces Max's aunt to allow the boy to travel with him to the tournament. Soon afterward, the media begins discussing the upcoming fight. During a broadcast, Champions League hosts reveal that Takmashido publicly criticized the previous match involving Adam. He described the outdated robot's appearance in professional competition as an insult to modern engineering. Unfortunately for Zeus's team, those comments create a public relations disaster. Fans rally behind Adam, and public pressure becomes impossible to ignore. As a result, Zeus is forced to face the challenge. A short time later, Charlie, Max, and Adam arrive at the championship tournament. The entire arena buzzes with anticipation. Meanwhile, Finn sees an opportunity to make a fortune. Confident that Adam has no real chance against Zeus, he begins accepting wagers. Most people believe the old scrapyard robot won't survive even a single round. Among those placing bets is Ricky. Still bitter from everything that happened, he confidently wagers $100,000 that Adam won't make it through the opening round. If he's right, he'll walk away with $500,000. The stage is finally set. As the lights dim, an elaborate introduction begins for Zeus. The champion robot enters like a superstar. Pyrotechnics explode. Music shakes the arena. Then Zeus launches dramatically into the ring as thousands of fans roar with excitement. Compared to that spectacle, Adam's entrance is humble and straightforward, yet many spectators cheer just as loudly. They've come to support the underdog. The bell rings. The fight begins. Zeus wastes no time. His very first punch sends Adam crashing to the canvas. The crowd gasps. To most viewers, the outcome already seems obvious. Adam manages to stand. Seconds later, another devastating combination sends him down again. Then it happens a third time. Each knockdown appears worse than the last. Still, Adam refuses to stay down. Every time he falls, he somehow rises again. As the punishment continues, Zeus corners Adam and relentlessly attacks. Charlie watches helplessly from ringside. Then something changes. He finally stops doubting. Trusting both Adam and himself, Charlie steps forward and begins fighting alongside the robot through the shadow feature. The effect is immediate. To everyone's astonishment, Adam starts pushing back. Punch after punch lands on the reigning champion. For the first time in years, Charlie's boxing instincts are back in action. Against all expectations, Adam survives until the end of the first round. Across the arena, Ricky immediately realizes his bet is doomed. He tries slipping away unnoticed. Unfortunately for him, Finn catches him before he can escape and happily collects the money he owes. The fight moves into the next rounds. Despite facing the most powerful robot in the world, Adam somehow survives the second round, then the third. The audience grows louder with every passing minute. By the fourth round, however, Zeus unleashes his full strength. The champion's attacks become even more brutal. Adam absorbs tremendous damage. Then disaster strikes. A powerful blow destroys Adam's voice control system completely. The robot loses one of its most important functions. Even so, Adam somehow stays standing until the round ends. At this point, victory seems almost impossible. Seeing the situation, Max urges his father to rely entirely on the shadow feature. The boy notices something else as well. For the first time, Farah Lemkova and Takmashido no longer look confident. Instead, they look worried. The little robot they dismissed as junk refuses to break. Eventually, Charlie gives in to Max's insistence. Before the final round starts, he speaks directly to Adam. The speech is heartfelt and sincere. Technically, the robot can't hear a single word, but Charlie talks to him anyway, like a coach addressing a fighter before the biggest match of his life. Then the fifth and final round begins. Charlie keeps Adam defensive at first. He blocks, he dodges. He forces Zeus to work harder and harder. Max becomes increasingly nervous. Every punch from Zeus feels like it could be the one that finally ends everything. Unable to contain himself, he begs his father to attack. Charlie shakes his head. Not yet, he waits patiently. He allows Zeus to burn through energy. Then, the moment arrives. Charlie launches a counterattack. Adam explodes forward with a barrage of powerful punches. The crowd erupts. For the first time in the fight, Zeus appears vulnerable. The supposedly unbeatable champion begins losing ground. Watching the situation unfold, Takmashido decides to intervene personally and takes direct control of Zeus. Even that isn't enough. Charlie continues pressing forward. Then comes the biggest moment of the entire match. Adam lands a thunderous uppercut that sends Zeus crashing to the floor. The arena nearly explodes from the reaction. Nobody can believe what they're witnessing. The champion gets back up. Charlie attacks again. Every lesson he ever learned as a boxer pours into Adam's movements. Combination after combination lands. Zeus is being tested like never before. Just as complete defeat seems possible, a loud gong echoes throughout the arena. The fight is over. Time has expired. Instantly, the crowd rises to its feet. Thousands of voices begin chanting Adam's name. The underdog has captured everyone's heart. Bailey rushes into the arena and embraces Charlie with a kiss. Officially, the judges award the victory to Zeus on points. The champion retains his title and remains at the top of Real Steel. But the result feels strangely hollow for Zeus's owners. From a public perspective, the evening is a disaster for their company. The mighty champion survived. Yet the unknown robot from a junkyard became the true hero. Fans everywhere declare Adam the people's champion. For Max, that's more than enough. Overwhelmed with emotion, he runs into Charlie's arms. No speech is necessary. The look on Charlie's face says everything. He's proud of his son, and more importantly, he finally loves him the way a father should. Together, Charlie, Max, and Adam step into the center of the arena. As the crowd continues cheering, they stand beneath the bright lights and enjoy the moment they fought so hard to earn, the respect, recognition, and glory that nobody ever believed they could achieve. When people first hear the premise of Real Steel, the reaction is usually one of two things. Either, that sounds awesome, or, wait, robot boxing? Honestly, I was somewhere in the middle. Because on paper, this movie sounds like the kind of idea that shouldn't really work. It's set in a near-future world where human boxing has basically faded into the background and giant robots now fight in packed arenas while crowds lose their minds, watching chunks of metal beat each other senseless. That alone sounds like a video game somebody pitched as a movie after staying up too late. But the strange thing is, Real Steel doesn't actually spend much time trying to convince you that robot boxing is a revolutionary science fiction concept. It doesn't stop to explain every detail of the future. It doesn't bombard you with endless world building. In fact, the movie is surprisingly casual about the whole thing. Robots fight, people bet on them, stadiums fill up, life goes on. The film just drops you into that reality and expects you to catch up, and, for the most part, it works. What caught me off guard is that Real Steel isn't really interested in being a science fiction movie, at least not in the way you'd expect. If you're going and hoping for a deep exploration of futuristic technology, artificial intelligence, or how society changed because robots replaced human fighters, you're probably going to be disappointed. The robots are important, sure, they're everywhere. They're the reason the story exists in the first place. But they're not the story. Underneath all the steel, flashing lights, giant arenas, and mechanical uppercuts, this is actually built like a very old-school sports drama, the kind of movie Hollywood has been making for decades. The futuristic setting is almost like a disguise. Once you get past the robot fights, you start noticing familiar ingredients underneath. The struggling fighter, the comeback story, the underdog chasing something bigger than himself, the personal baggage, the family issues. The dream that seems completely out of reach until it suddenly isn't. That's really what Real Steel is selling. The robot boxing just happens to be the hook, and to be fair, it's a pretty effective hook. Because even if the premise sounds ridiculous when you describe it out loud, there's something immediately entertaining about watching these giant machines step into a ring while thousands of people treat it with the same intensity as a heavyweight title fight. The movie understands that. It leans into the spectacle without overcomplicating things. What's interesting is that the more the film goes on, the less I found myself thinking about the future setting, and the more I started paying attention to the people inside it. The world becomes familiar very quickly. After a while, robot boxing almost feels normal, which is probably one of the movie's smartest decisions. It never asks you to believe every detail. It just asks you to enjoy the ride. And whether that works for you will probably depend on what you're expecting. If you're looking for hard science fiction, this isn't really that movie. But if you're willing to accept the futuristic backdrop and focus on the story hiding underneath it, Real Steel starts revealing what it actually wants to be. Not a movie about robots. Not really. A movie about people, wrapped inside one of the most crowd-pleasing concepts Hollywood could come up with. One thing I genuinely wasn't expecting from Real Steel was how quickly it gets you comfortable with its world. Think about it for a second. A movie tells you that human boxing is basically obsolete now. Giant robots are fighting in sold-out arenas. People are gambling on them, building careers around them, traveling across the country with them, and somehow nobody finds any of this unusual. That's a lot to ask an audience to accept. Yet the movie rarely stops to explain itself. There isn't some scientist standing in front of a holographic screen giving a lecture about how society changed. Nobody sits down and delivers a 10-minute history lesson about the rise of robot combat. The film just lets the world exist around the characters and trusts that you'll piece things together as you go. I actually appreciated that. The details show up naturally. You see huge professional arenas packed with fans, complete with sponsors, media coverage, rankings, celebrity fighters, and championship belts. Then a little later you're watching illegal fights in rough locations where robots are literally getting torn apart for quick cash. Without making a big deal out of it, the movie establishes an entire ecosystem around robot boxing, and honestly, it feels weirdly believable. Not the giant robots themselves, obviously, but the way people behave around them, the obsession, the money, the hype, the betting, the constant search for the next champion. It all feels very familiar because we've already seen versions of it in real sports. The movie simply swaps out human fighters for machines. There's actually a funny thought buried underneath all of this. Traditional boxing has always come with an uncomfortable reality. Two people are getting hurt for our entertainment. Here, that problem disappears. Nobody is worried about broken ribs or brain damage because the fighters are made of metal. The crowd still gets the violence, the promoters still get the money, the fans still get their spectacle. It's kind of a clever idea when you think about it. The film never dives too deeply into the ethics of it, but it's sitting there in the background. What's interesting is how focused the technology is. In most futuristic movies, once advanced robotics exist, they're everywhere. They're cooking dinner, driving cars, running cities, taking over humanity. You know the usual stuff. Real Steel doesn't really care about any of that. These robots exist primarily to fight. That's it. Some people might see that as a missed opportunity. Others might see it as refreshing. Personally, I think it helps the movie stay focused. The story isn't constantly getting distracted by bigger science fiction questions. It picks one idea and commits to it. The mechanics of the robots are actually pretty cool too. Different models have different strengths, different fighting styles, different levels of sophistication. Some are expensive championship machines loaded with advanced technology. Others are old, battered relics held together by spare parts and optimism. And somehow those older machines end up being the most interesting ones. The movie also does a good job making the robots feel physical. They aren't floating CGI creations with no weight behind them. When they hit each other, you feel it. Metal bends, parts break, components fly off. Every fight feels expensive in a way that makes sense for the people involved. You understand why owners become attached to these machines. You understand why losing one can be devastating. What surprised me most, though, is how quickly robot boxing starts feeling normal. Maybe 10 or 15 minutes into the movie, I stopped questioning the premise altogether. By that point, I wasn't thinking, why would society replace human boxing with robots? I was thinking, can this robot actually win? And that's probably the biggest compliment I can give the world building. The movie doesn't convince you through explanations, it convinces you by making you care. Once you're invested in the people and the robots, the world takes care of itself. What's kind of funny about Real Steel is that it's often remembered as a science fiction movie, but the longer I sat with it, the less it felt like one. Technically, sure, it checks the boxes. It's set in the future. There are giant robots. Advanced technology exists. People are controlling machines that can throw punches hard enough to tear each other apart. On paper, that's science fiction. But when you're actually watching the movie, it rarely behaves like science fiction. Most films built around futuristic technology can't resist asking bigger questions. What happens when machines become smarter than humans? How does society change? What do people gain? What do they lose? Usually that's where these stories go. Real Steel mostly shrugs and says, anyway, let's get to the next fight. And I don't mean that as criticism. In fact, I think that's one of the reasons the movie still works for so many people. The future here isn't the destination. It's more like the backdrop hanging behind the real story. You could take a lot of this plot, strip away the robots completely, and the emotional core would still function almost exactly the same. The relationships wouldn't change. The character arcs wouldn't change. Even most of the themes would survive intact. That's a pretty good clue about what kind of movie this actually wants to be. The robots aren't here to explore technology. They're here to create a different arena for familiar human stories. There were moments where I did find myself wanting a little more, though. Not because the movie failed at what it was trying to do, but because the world it created felt interesting enough to explore further. You start wondering how robot boxing became so popular. What happened to traditional combat sports? Why did society embrace this? Are these machines used for anything besides fighting? The film gives you hints here and there, but never much beyond that. Some viewers will probably see that as a missed opportunity. I can understand that. At the same time, I think the movie avoids a trap that a lot of science fiction films fall into. It never gets so caught up explaining its technology that it forgets to tell a story. We've all seen movies where characters spend half the runtime explaining rules, systems, algorithms, artificial intelligence, and futuristic jargon until the human side gets buried underneath it all. Real Steel goes in the opposite direction. Sometimes almost too far in the opposite direction. There are a few ideas floating around the edges that feel like they could have become something bigger. The relationship between humans and machines, for example. The suggestion that certain robots might be developing something that resembles personality. The tension between old technology and new technology. Even the idea that a machine can become a symbol people emotionally invest in. The movie touches those ideas, then it moves on. And honestly, that's probably because it understands its audience. Most people weren't showing up for a philosophical discussion about robotics. They wanted to watch giant metal boxers beat each other senseless while rooting for an underdog. The film knows exactly where its priorities are. What I do appreciate is that the technology never feels magical. The robots aren't treated like supernatural beings. They break, they malfunction, they need repairs, they need operators. They're machines first and foremost. That grounded approach actually makes the world feel more believable than a lot of much bigger science fiction movies. Even years later, the future imagined by Real Steel doesn't feel completely detached from reality. Sure, the timeline didn't exactly work out. We don't have robot boxing leagues taking over the sports world, at least not yet. But the technology itself feels strangely achievable. Remote controls, motion tracking, machine learning, human operators working alongside advanced hardware. Those ideas don't feel absurd anymore. If anything, they feel closer now than they did when the movie first came out, which leaves Real Steel in an interesting spot. It's a science fiction movie that isn't really interested in science fiction. It's a future-set film that's far more interested in people than technology. And somehow that decision ends up making the futuristic elements more effective, not less. Because the movie never asks you to fall in love with the future, it asks you to care about the people living in it. Before we get into the robots, the fights, or even Adam himself, we have to talk about Charlie Kenton, because whether you end up loving this movie or just liking parts of it, everything really starts with him. And honestly, the movie takes a bit of a risk with how it introduces him. A lot of sports dramas want you rooting for the main character immediately. They make him sympathetic, they give him bad luck, unfair circumstances, maybe a tragic backstory. You instantly understand why he's struggling. Real Steel doesn't exactly do that. When we first meet Charlie, he's kind of a mess. Not the charming Hollywood kind of mess either. He's constantly chasing money he doesn't have, making questionable decisions, jumping from one bad situation to another. Every time it feels like he's learned a lesson, he somehow finds a new way to make things worse for himself. The guy has a remarkable talent for turning problems into bigger problems. What's interesting is that Charlie isn't really introduced as a victim of circumstance. The movie makes it pretty clear that a lot of his troubles are self-inflicted. He gambles, he cuts corners, he takes risks that don't pay off. He spends most of the opening act acting like someone who's been running from responsibility for so long that he doesn't even know how to stop anymore. And then Max shows up. Not because Charlie wants him to, not because he's suddenly ready to become a father. The kid basically crashes into his life at the exact moment Charlie is least equipped to deal with him. That's where things get interesting. Because underneath all the confidence and bravado, Charlie feels like somebody who's stuck in the past. You can see traces of the boxer he used to be, the dream he never fully let go of, the version of himself he probably still imagines whenever things aren't going his way. But reality isn't interested in those old dreams anymore. Human boxing is gone. His fighting career is over. The world moved on. Charlie didn't. A lot of his character starts making more sense once you look at him that way. He's not just chasing money, he's chasing relevance. He's trying to prove that he still matters in a world that has already replaced him. And that's probably why Hugh Jackman works so well here. Because if you really think about it, Charlie shouldn't be that likable. There are moments where he's selfish, moments where he's frustrating, moments where you just want him to grow up already. Yet Jackman somehow keeps the character watchable. Part of it is pure screen presence. The guy has always had that. He can walk into a scene carrying a terrible idea and somehow convince you to stick around long enough to see what happens next. But there's something else too. You get the sense that Charlie knows he's failing. Not openly, not in some dramatic speech. It's hidden underneath the arrogance. Every bad decision feels like it's coming from desperation rather than malice. That doesn't excuse it, but it does make him more understandable. And I think that's why the character gradually wins people over. The movie never completely transforms him into a saint. It doesn't suddenly erase all his flaws. He's still stubborn, still impulsive, still capable of making questionable choices right up until the end. What changes is his priorities. For most of the movie's opening stretch, Charlie is fighting for himself, for money, for pride, for another shot at success. Eventually, without fully realizing it, he starts fighting for something bigger than that. That's the real journey happening underneath all the robot boxing. The comeback story isn't really about getting back into the spotlight. It's about a man slowly figuring out what actually matters. And what I like is that the movie doesn't rush it. Charlie doesn't wake up one morning as a better person. He stumbles toward it, sometimes reluctantly, sometimes accidentally, sometimes while still making mistakes, which, honestly, feels a lot more human than most redemption arcs tend to. By the time the story really gets moving, Charlie isn't necessarily a hero yet. But he's no longer just a guy chasing the next payday either. He's somewhere in between. And that's where the character becomes interesting. Now, Charlie's story only works because Max is standing on the other side of it. And I'll be honest, Max is probably the character that splits audiences more than anyone else in this movie. I've seen people absolutely love him, and I've seen people spend 2 hours wishing he would stop talking. Honestly, I kind of understand both reactions. When Max first enters the story, he's not written like a typical grieving child. His mother has just died, his life has been turned upside down, and he's suddenly forced to spend time with a father who has basically been absent his entire life. That's a lot for an 11-year-old kid to process. Yet Max arrives with this strange combination of confidence, attitude, curiosity, and stubborn determination. Sometimes he's surprisingly mature. Sometimes he's incredibly annoying. Sometimes he's both within the same scene. But I think that's part of what makes him feel memorable. The easy version of this character would have been a sad kid looking for a father figure. We've seen that character countless times before. Instead, Max spends a good chunk of the movie challenging Charlie, questioning him, calling him out, and refusing to simply accept whatever nonsense his father throws at him. And Charlie throws a lot of nonsense. What I found interesting is that Max doesn't really enter the story looking for sympathy. He's looking for answers. He's trying to figure out who this guy is, why he disappeared, whether he's worth believing in, whether he's worth caring about at all. There's a lot of skepticism underneath the excitement. And honestly, that's what makes the relationship feel more believable. Because if your absent father suddenly showed up after years of not being there, you probably wouldn't immediately run into his arms either. You'd test him. You'd challenge him. You'd want proof. That's basically what Max spends most of the movie doing. At the same time, he's also the source of a lot of the film's energy. Charlie enters almost every situation expecting failure. Max enters almost every situation expecting possibility. That's a huge difference. Where Charlie sees broken machines, Max sees potential. Where Charlie sees risk, Max sees opportunity. Where Charlie is carrying years of disappointment, Max is still young enough to believe impossible things might actually happen. And that optimism ends up becoming surprisingly important. Without Max, Adam is just another discarded machine sitting in a junkyard. Without Max, Charlie probably keeps making the same mistakes over and over. Without Max, there really isn't much of a story. He's the character constantly pushing things forward. And I think Dakota Goyo deserves a lot of credit for making that work. Because child performances can be tricky in movies like this. Sometimes they're written too cute. Sometimes they're unrealistically wise. Sometimes they feel like miniature adults pretending to be children. Max occasionally gets close to those traps, but Goyo somehow keeps him grounded. He gives the character enough enthusiasm to be believable, but also enough attitude to make him feel like a real kid rather than some perfectly behaved movie child. Even when Max is being frustrating, there's usually a reason for it. You understand where it's coming from. What I ended up appreciating most is that the film never treats Max like baggage. A lot of father-son stories accidentally do that. The child becomes a lesson for the adult to learn. Here, Max actually has agency. He discovers things, he drives decisions, he influences outcomes. Sometimes it feels like he's the one dragging Charlie through the story rather than the other way around. And maybe that's why the movie works as well as it does. Because underneath all the robot fights and underdog victories, Max represents something Charlie lost a long time ago. Belief. Not just belief in Adam, not even belief in winning. Belief that things can still get better. Belief that failure isn't permanent. Belief that something broken doesn't have to stay broken. And as the story moves forward, you start realizing that Max isn't just learning from Charlie. Charlie is learning just as much from him. And this is where Real Steel quietly reveals what it's actually about. Because by this point, it becomes pretty obvious that the robot boxing is only half the story. Maybe not even half. The real challenge Charlie faces isn't winning fights. It isn't paying off debts. It isn't climbing back into the spotlight. It's figuring out how to be a father to a kid who has every reason not to trust him. That's a much harder fight. What I like about the father-son relationship in Real Steel is that the movie doesn't pretend these two instantly connect. They don't. In fact, for a while, they barely seem capable of spending a day together without arguing. And honestly, why would they? Charlie wasn't there. That's the uncomfortable truth sitting underneath every conversation they have. Max isn't meeting a father he's missed his whole life. He's meeting a stranger who happens to share his last name. There's a difference. The movie understands that. A lot of films rush this kind of relationship. They'll throw in a few bonding scenes, maybe a heart-to-heart conversation, and suddenly, everybody's one big happy family. Real Steel takes a slower route. Not perfect, but slower. Most of their early interactions feel transactional. Charlie sees Max as a responsibility he didn't ask for. Max sees Charlie as someone who has a lot of explaining to do. They're constantly testing each other, pushing buttons, looking for weaknesses, trying to figure out where the boundaries are. And honestly, some of the funniest moments in the movie come from that tension, because neither one of them really knows how to handle the other. Charlie has spent years living like a lone wolf. Max shows up with questions, opinions, ideas, and absolutely no intention of staying quiet. The kid disrupts everything. What's interesting is that their relationship doesn't improve because they sit down and talk through their feelings. Most of the time, they bond by doing things together, messing with robots, traveling, fixing problems, getting into new problems 5 minutes later. The connection develops through shared experiences more than emotional speeches, and that feels closer to how a lot of real relationships actually work. You spend enough time around someone, enough things happen, and eventually the walls start coming down. Sometimes without either person noticing. That's exactly what starts happening here. Little moments begin stacking on top of each other. Charlie starts paying attention. Max starts lowering his guard. Neither transformation happens overnight. They're gradual, messy, occasionally interrupted by another argument. What surprised me is how much Adam ends up sitting at the center of all this. Not emotionally in the beginning, but structurally. Adam becomes the thing they both care about. The common goal, the project, the excuse to spend time together. And before long, they're no longer working on Adam. They're working alongside each other. That's an important difference. The robot becomes a bridge neither of them probably would have crossed otherwise. And I think that's why the relationship lands for so many people, even when parts of the story feel predictable. You know where it's going. Let's be honest, most viewers know where it's going almost immediately. You know they're going to grow closer. You know Charlie is going to change. You know the emotional payoff is coming. But knowing the destination isn't always the problem. The question is whether the journey feels earned. For me, that's where the movie does most of its heavy lifting. Not because it's subtle. It really isn't. Not because it's groundbreaking. It definitely isn't. It works because both characters are changing at the same time. Max isn't just teaching Charlie how to be a better father. Charlie is giving Max something too, a connection he never had. Someone to believe in. Someone imperfect, absolutely, but someone who is finally trying. And that's probably what makes the relationship resonate. Neither one of them gets exactly what they wanted. Instead, they get what they needed. By the time the story reaches its biggest fights and highest stakes, the robot matches almost become secondary. You're still invested in Adam. You're still invested in the competition. But underneath all of that, what you're really watching is two people slowly finding their way toward becoming a family. And surprisingly, that's the part of Real Steel that lasts the longest after the credits roll. Now here's the part that I didn't fully expect the first time I watched Real Steel. At some point, without really announcing it, Adam stops being a piece of equipment. He stops being the robot, and somehow becomes the character you're rooting for the most. Which is honestly kind of ridiculous when you think about it. Adam doesn't talk. He doesn't crack jokes. He doesn't deliver emotional speeches. He's literally a machine made of metal parts and worn-out components. Yet by the middle of the movie, I found myself more emotionally invested in Adam's journey than I was in some actual human characters. That's not an easy thing for a film to pull off. What helps is the way Adam enters the story. He's not introduced as some cutting-edge championship machine. He isn't the newest model or some secret military project disguised as a boxer. Quite the opposite, actually. He's Scrap, an outdated sparring robot buried in a junkyard, forgotten, discarded, written off by everyone except Max. And I think that's where the connection starts, because Adam immediately feels different from all the flashy robots we've seen before. The expensive machines are impressive, sure. They're bigger, stronger, faster, packed with technology. But Adam feels vulnerable. You look at him and instantly understand he's not supposed to be here. He's the robot equivalent of someone showing up to a Formula One race in a car that's been sitting in a garage for 15 years. There's something strangely endearing about that. The movie never has to tell you, Adam is an underdog. You can see it. Every scratch, dent, and missing piece tells the story for you. What's clever is that Adam's rise mirrors what's happening with Charlie and Max. All three of them are damaged in different ways. Charlie is trying to reclaim a life that slipped away from him. Max is trying to find where he belongs. Adam is a machine everybody else already gave up on. They're all carrying some version of the same struggle. Maybe that's why the partnership feels natural. None of them fit into the world they're trying to succeed in. And because of that, every small victory feels bigger. One thing I really like is that the movie never turns Adam into some magical super robot. At least not entirely. He's not winning because he secretly has hidden weapons or some ridiculous upgrade nobody knew about. Most of the time, Adam survives because he can take punishment. And I mean a lot of punishment. If most championship robots are built to dominate, Adam is built to endure. There's a difference. You start noticing that his greatest strength isn't power, it's resilience. He keeps getting back up, over and over. That quality becomes surprisingly emotional after a while. Not because the robot itself is emotional, but because everybody watching starts projecting meaning onto it. The audience inside the movie does it. The characters do it, and honestly, we do it too. A machine takes enough hits and keeps standing, and suddenly it starts representing something bigger than machinery. Persistence. Determination. Refusing to quit when common sense says you probably should. That's classic underdog storytelling. The movie just happens to package it inside a giant metal boxer. There's also this interesting little thread running through the film where it almost feels like Adam has a personality, not in an obvious science fiction way. The movie never fully commits to saying Adam is alive or self-aware. Actually, it stays frustratingly vague about it. There are moments where you wonder if there's something more happening beneath the surface. Little gestures, small reactions, tiny details that seem to suggest a level of awareness. Then the film pulls back before answering the question. Part of me wishes it explored that idea more. Another part of me thinks leaving it unanswered is probably the smarter choice, because the mystery becomes part of Adam's appeal. Everybody watching gets to decide for themselves. Was Adam special? Or were Charlie and Max simply giving meaning to something they desperately wanted to believe in? I honestly don't know, and I kind of like that I don't know. What I do know is that by the time the story reaches its biggest moments, Adam no longer feels like a prop. He feels essential, not because he's the strongest robot, not because he's the most advanced, not because he's the coolest design in the movie. It's because he's earned our investment. Somewhere along the way, this battered old machine becomes the emotional center of the entire film. The fights matter because Adam is fighting. The victories matter because Adam earns them. The setbacks hurt because we've watched him climb this far, and that's probably the biggest compliment I can give. Real Steel. Out of all the characters in the movie, the one with the fewest lines somehow leaves the biggest impression. Years after watching the film, people still remember Charlie. They remember Max. But more often than not, the character they remember first is Adam. Not bad for a robot that was originally sitting in a junkyard waiting to be forgotten. The more I thought about Real Steel, the more I realize there's another battle happening underneath all the robot boxing. And it's actually got nothing to do with championships. It's the constant tug-of-war between human skill and machine intelligence. The movie never turns this into some huge philosophical debate. Nobody sits down and starts talking about the future of artificial intelligence or whether machines will eventually replace humans. That's not really the film's style. But the idea keeps showing up anyway, sometimes quietly, sometimes right in front of you. You see it most clearly in the difference between Adam and the robots he's fighting. Most of the elite machines in this world are built to be superior. They're faster, stronger, more advanced, loaded with expensive technology, backed by teams with endless resources. Everything about them screams efficiency. Adam isn't that. He's old, outdated, built for training rather than competition. And yet somehow he keeps surviving. Not because he's the smartest machine in the room, not because he has the best hardware, but because there's always a human element attached to him. That's where things get interesting. One of Adam's most unique abilities is something called shadow mode. On paper, it's actually pretty simple. Adam can mirror the movements of a human operator standing nearby. The first time you see it, it's cool. The second time you see it, you start realizing what it means, because suddenly the robot isn't fighting alone anymore. The machine becomes an extension of the person controlling it. Every movement, every dodge, every punch. Human skill is being transferred directly into the fight, and for Charlie, that matters a lot. Remember, Charlie comes from the era before robot boxing took over. He was an actual boxer. He understands timing, rhythm, footwork, instinct. He understands things that don't necessarily fit into a computer program. For most of the movie, he's living in a world that has moved beyond him. Then Adam shows up and gives him a way back into the fight, not as a fighter, but as something equally important, a teacher, a strategist, a guide. What's fascinating is that the film almost treats experience like its own form of technology. Everybody else is investing in newer machines. Charlie is investing in knowledge. The movie seems genuinely interested in that contrast. On one side, you have robots built with endless money and cutting-edge engineering. On the other, you have a machine nobody wanted anymore being guided by people who refuse to quit. It's not exactly subtle, but it works. Then there's Zeus, and Zeus feels like the opposite philosophy entirely. Everything about Zeus is designed to represent technological perfection. He's bigger than everyone else, more powerful, more sophisticated. He's introduced almost like a final boss waiting at the end of a video game. Even the way people talk about him feels different. There's this sense that Zeus represents what technology is supposed to become, the ultimate machine, the future, the unbeatable standard. And honestly, that's probably why the final matchup feels bigger than just another boxing match. Because by that point, it isn't really Adam versus Zeus anymore. It's an old idea versus a new one. Human intuition versus technological superiority. Heart versus optimization. Experience versus efficiency. The movie obviously has a favorite side in that argument, but what surprised me is that it never completely dismisses technology either. This isn't one of those stories where machines are evil and humans save the day. The robots are tools. Powerful tools, sure, but still tools. The film keeps coming back to the idea that technology becomes meaningful because of the people using it. Without Charlie, Adam is scrap metal. Without Max, Adam never even gets discovered. Without both of them working together, there isn't a story. And I think that's ultimately what Real Steel is saying. Not that machines are bad, not that humans are superior, but that neither one is enough on its own. The strongest moments in the film happen when human determination and technology start working together instead of competing against each other. It's a surprisingly optimistic idea, actually, especially now, because watching the movie years later, when conversations about artificial intelligence are everywhere, some of these themes land differently than they did back then. Real Steel isn't trying to predict the future. It's not making grand statements about robotics. But buried underneath all the spectacle is a simple idea that still feels relevant. Technology can be powerful, maybe even extraordinary. But the things that inspire us most usually aren't the machines themselves. It's the people behind them. The dreamers, the believers, the stubborn individuals who refuse to stop trying even when every logical reason says they should. In Real Steel, Adam may be the one throwing the punches. But the heart behind those punches always belongs to somebody else. Now, if you've watched enough sports movies, There's a moment in Real Steel where you start smiling because you realize exactly what the movie is doing. Not because it's hiding it, because it's absolutely not. Real Steel wears its influences right out in the open. And honestly, I think it knows that. The funny thing is, the movie spends so much time introducing robots, futuristic technology, and giant metal fighters that it's easy to forget how traditional the story underneath really is. Strip away the steel, the LEDs, the motion controls, and the futuristic arenas, and what you're left with is one of the oldest sports stories Hollywood has ever told, the underdog story, the kind that's been working for decades, maybe longer. You know the setup, a washed-up fighter who nobody believes in anymore. A long-shot contender with almost no chance of succeeding. A climb through increasingly difficult opponents. A championship hanging somewhere in the distance, everybody saying it can't be done, and then somebody deciding to try anyway. We've seen versions of this story 100 times, maybe 1,000. The surprising thing isn't that Real Steel follows that formula, it's how comfortable it is doing so. The movie never tries to convince you that it's reinventing sports cinema. It doesn't spend time creating clever twists designed to shock the audience. Most viewers can probably predict the broad outline of the story pretty early on. And yet, it still works. That's the part I kept coming back to. Because predictability isn't always the same thing as failure. Sometimes people talk about predictable movies as if knowing where a story is heading automatically ruins it. I don't really agree with that. A lot of great sports films are predictable. The excitement comes from watching the journey unfold, not from being surprised by the destination. Real Steel understands that. The moment Adam starts winning fights, you already know what's eventually coming. Of course there's going to be a bigger challenge. Of course there's going to be a seemingly impossible opponent waiting at the top. Of course the stakes are going to keep rising. The movie practically puts all its cards face up on the table. But because Adam is so easy to root for, you stop worrying about whether the outcome is predictable. You start caring about how they get there. That's a different kind of investment. And I think the film benefits from connecting the underdog formula to more than just the robot fights. Adam is an underdog. Charlie is an underdog. Even Max, in a strange way, feels like an underdog. Nobody enters this story from a position of strength. Nobody has control over their lives. Nobody looks like a future champion. That's what makes the narrative feel cohesive. The fights aren't separate from the character arcs. They're reflections of them. Every time Adam gets knocked down and gets back up, it echoes what Charlie is trying to do with his own life. Every unlikely victory feels connected to the idea that people don't have to remain trapped by their past failures. It's familiar territory, sure, but it's effective territory. The movie also understands one of the most important rules of any underdog story. The audience has to believe losing is possible. That's where Adam's design helps so much. He's never presented as unbeatable. Actually, most of the time he looks outmatched, smaller, older, less advanced. Sometimes he survives fights that feel borderline unfair. And that vulnerability creates tension. The audience doesn't cheer because Adam is the strongest robot. They cheer because he clearly isn't. That's a huge difference. Nobody roots for Goliath. They root for David. Real Steel leans into that dynamic over and over again. And honestly, I don't think the movie would have worked nearly as well if Adam had been some secret superweapon hidden inside a junkyard. The fact that he's constantly at a disadvantage is what makes the victory satisfying. You feel like they earned every step forward. Now, if you're somebody who absolutely hates sports movie cliches, there's a good chance this film will drive you crazy. Because they're everywhere. The training sequences, the comeback moments, the impossible odds, the championship dream, the emotional speeches, the crowd slowly turning in favor of the underdog. It's all here. The movie isn't subtle about any of it. But for me, the difference comes down to sincerity. Real Steel never feels embarrassed by what it is. It embraces every ounce of that classic sports movie DNA and just commits fully. No irony, no winking at the audience, no attempts to apologize for being inspirational. And weirdly enough, that confidence makes the formula easier to accept. You may know exactly where the story is heading. The movie probably knows you know. But sometimes a familiar story told with enough energy and conviction can be just as satisfying as something completely unpredictable. Real Steel isn't trying to surprise you with its underdog journey. It's trying to make you care about it. And for a lot of people, that's exactly what it manages to do. At this point, we kind of have to address the elephant in the room. Because depending on who you ask, Real Steel is either a really effective crowd pleaser or a movie made almost entirely from pieces borrowed from other movies. And honestly, both arguments have some truth to them. The first time I watched it, I wasn't even halfway through before I started recognizing familiar DNA. Not specific scenes necessarily, but familiar rhythms, familiar story beats, familiar emotional setups. You can feel the influence of classic boxing movies almost immediately. You can feel the father-son road trip story underneath it. You can feel the comeback narrative, the training montages, the impossible championship dream, the aging fighter trying to prove something, the kid looking for connection. None of these ideas are new, not even close. And Real Steel doesn't spend much energy pretending they are. What's interesting is how openly the movie embraces those influences. There are films that borrow from older stories while trying to disguise it. Real Steel feels more like it walks into the room and says, "Yeah, we know you've seen some of this before. Anyway, check out this giant robot." There's something oddly honest about that approach. Now, if originality is the single most important thing you look for in movies, I can absolutely see why Real Steel might leave you frustrated. Because there are stretches where you can almost predict the next scene before it happens. Not because the writing is bad, just because the structure is so familiar. You start recognizing the patterns, the setback before the comeback, the emotional reconciliation before the big event, the training sequence before the challenge, the underdog earning respect from the crowd. These moments are practically part of the sports movie handbook, and Real Steel checks a lot of those boxes. But here's where things get a little complicated. I've never really believed that originality alone determines whether a movie works. If that were true, half of Hollywood history wouldn't exist. Most stories are built from familiar pieces. What matters is what you do with those pieces. Execution matters. Energy matters, emotion matters, and maybe most importantly, whether the audience actually cares. That's where Real Steel manages to win a lot of people over. Because even when you see the machinery of the plot working, the movie keeps moving with enough confidence that you often stop focusing on how familiar it is. You're too busy rooting for Adam, or laughing at Charlie, or waiting to see whether Max's optimism finally pays off. The familiarity starts becoming part of the comfort rather than a distraction. It's kind of like listening to a favorite song. You know every note, you know exactly where it's going, but that doesn't necessarily make the experience worse. Sometimes it makes it better. And I think that's the category Real Steel falls into for a lot of viewers. Not because it's breaking new ground, because it understands why these storytelling formulas survived in the first place. They work. Now, to be fair, there are moments where the film leans so heavily into those familiar structures that it gets dangerously close to feeling assembled rather than written. Like someone took a handful of successful movies, pulled out their strongest components, and built a new movie from those parts. Every now and then you can see the seams. You notice where one influence ends and another begins. That's probably the biggest criticism I understand when it comes to Real Steel. Not that it's familiar, that it occasionally becomes too comfortable relying on that familiarity. Because there are ideas inside this movie that could have pushed things further. The robot boxing concept alone opens so many possibilities. Questions about technology, competition, human relevance, the relationship between people and machines. Some of those ideas get explored, some get brushed past. And sometimes the movie chooses a familiar emotional beat when a more ambitious direction was sitting right there. But at the same time, I can't completely fault it for that. Because Real Steel never feels cynical. That's important. There are movies that recycle old ideas because they have nothing new to say. This doesn't feel like one of them. It feels more like a film that genuinely loves the stories it's borrowing inspiration from. The sports dramas, the underdog tales, the father-son stories, the crowd-pleasing adventures where heart matters more than innovation. And whether that's enough will probably depend on what you're looking for. If you're searching for a revolutionary science fiction masterpiece, you're probably going to leave disappointed. If you're looking for a familiar story told with sincerity, energy, and just enough personality to make it feel fresh again, there's a good chance you'll connect with it. Because Real Steel isn't trying to reinvent the wheel. It's taking a wheel that already works and attaching it to a giant boxing robot. Somehow, that ends up being more effective than it sounds. Now, for all the conversations about family drama, redemption arcs, sports movie formulas, and father-son relationships, let's be honest about something. Most people didn't buy a ticket to Real Steel because they wanted a deep emotional study of broken relationships. They came for the robots punching each other, and thankfully, the movie seems fully aware of that. Because if the fight scenes didn't work, a huge part of this film would fall apart. What's interesting is that the action isn't treated like some side attraction between dramatic scenes. The fights are woven directly into the story. Every major match feels like it's pushing the characters forward in some way. That sounds simple, but a lot of movies struggle with that balance. Sometimes action scenes feel disconnected from everything else. Fun in the moment, but ultimately disposable. Real Steel does a better job than I expected. Every fight means something. Sometimes it's about survival. Sometimes it's about money. Sometimes it's about proving a point. And eventually, it becomes about belief. The first thing that struck me is how physical the robot boxing feels. These aren't graceful action sequences, they're heavy. You can almost feel the weight behind every impact. When one robot lands a clean hit, it doesn't look like a superhero movie where characters bounce around without consequences. Metal bends, components crack, parts fly across the arena, damage accumulates. The robots don't just lose fights, they get wrecked, and somehow that makes the matches feel more intense. I think a lot of that comes from how the movie approaches boxing itself. Even though the fighters are machines, the filmmakers clearly studied real boxing. There's footwork, there's timing, there's strategy. Fighters get cornered, they adjust. They survive rounds they probably shouldn't survive. The robots move like boxers rather than giant action figures smashing into each other. That distinction matters because it allows the audience to follow the fight as a competition instead of just visual chaos. And honestly, that's where some robot action movies stumble. Bigger isn't always better. More explosions don't automatically create excitement. What creates excitement is investment. You have to care who wins. Real Steel figures that out pretty quickly. By the time Adam starts climbing through the rankings, the fights stop being about spectacle alone. You're emotionally attached now. You want to see what happens. You start celebrating small victories, a good counterpunch, a comeback round, a moment where Adam survives when he probably shouldn't. The movie turns boxing mechanics into emotional moments. That's not easy to do. One thing I particularly liked is how different the opponents feel throughout the film. Each robot enters with its own identity, its own style, its own personality, even without speaking. Some look intimidating because of their size. Others feel dangerous because of their speed or design. You never get the sense that you're watching the same fight repeated over and over. There's progression. The stakes keep escalating. The competition keeps getting tougher. And because Adam starts from such an obvious disadvantage, every step forward feels earned. Now, having said all that, I do understand one criticism that comes up fairly often. There are actually fewer major fights than people sometimes remember. It's funny how memory works. When people think about Real Steel, they often remember wall-to-wall robot combat. But if you revisit the movie, a surprising amount of screen time is devoted to character development, travel, relationships, and building Adam's rise. Some matches are even rushed through montages. And depending on what you're looking for, that might be disappointing. If your main reason for watching is giant robots fighting, there are moments where you might wish the movie stayed in the ring longer. I definitely found myself wanting a few of Adam's victories to breathe a little more. The climb up the ladder is exciting, and occasionally it feels like the film skips ahead faster than I'd like. But then again, the movie is trying to tell two stories at once, the sports story and the family story, and for the most part, it manages to keep both moving. Then we get to the big fights. The ones the entire movie has been building toward. What's fascinating is that the final matches don't necessarily work because they're the most technically impressive. They work because of everything that came before them. By that stage, the audience isn't just watching a robot fight. They're watching months of struggle, setbacks, bad decisions, repaired relationships, and impossible expectations collide inside a boxing ring. The action becomes emotional. That's the difference. A punch isn't just a punch anymore. A round isn't just a round. Every hit carries weight because the audience understands what's attached to it. And when a movie reaches that point, the action has already succeeded. Not because it looks cool, though it definitely does, because it makes you care. At the end of the day, that's probably why the robot fights in Real Steel have stayed memorable for so many people. The choreography is strong, the spectacle is entertaining, the sound design helps every hit land, the visual effects hold up remarkably well. But none of those things are the real secret. The real secret is that somewhere along the way, the movie convinced us that this battered old robot mattered. Once that happens, every fight suddenly feels bigger than the ring itself, and that's when the action becomes more than just action. Of course, none of those fights would have worked if the robots themselves didn't work, and honestly, this is where Real Steel surprised me the most when I revisited it. Because, let's be real for a second, this movie came out in 2011. A lot of effects, heavy films from that era haven't aged particularly well. You go back and watch them today, and there are moments where the CGI starts showing its age, sometimes badly. Real Steel isn't completely immune to that, but it's held up far better than I expected. In some scenes, surprisingly well. The first thing that stands out is how tangible everything feels. The robots don't look like glowing video game characters floating around inside a digital environment. They feel like actual machines occupying physical space. There's weight to them, mass, presence. When Adam walks into a room, you don't feel like you're watching an effect. You feel like you're watching a several hundred-pound piece of machinery stomping across concrete. That sounds like a small thing, but it makes a huge difference. A lot of visual effects succeed because of detail rather than spectacle, and Real Steel understands that. The scratches on the metal, the dents from previous fights, the exposed wiring, the damaged panels, the chipped paint. Every robot looks like it has lived a life before we met it. That's important because the movie spends so much time asking us to emotionally invest in machines. If the robots felt artificial, the entire story would collapse. Instead, they feel oddly believable. Not realistic in the sense that we're all going to own boxing robots next year, but believable within the world the movie creates. I also love how different the robot designs are from one another. A lot of movies fall into the trap of making every machine look like a slightly altered version of the same design. Bigger shoulders here, different colors there. Real Steel actually gives its robots identities. You can recognize them instantly. Noisy Boy doesn't look like Adam. Adam doesn't look like Zeus. Zeus doesn't look like any of the underground fighters. Each one tells you something before the fight even starts. Some robots look elegant. Some look intimidating. Some look like walking tanks. Others look like they shouldn't survive a single round. The designs do a lot of storytelling without needing dialogue. And then there's Adam. Honestly, Adam's design is probably one of the smartest decisions in the entire movie. Because he's not flashy. He's not covered in weapons. He doesn't look futuristic compared to the championship robots. In fact, he almost looks ordinary, simple, functional, worn down. That design choice matters because it immediately reinforces the underdog angle. The second Adam appears, you understand exactly where he stands in this world. He looks like a machine everybody forgot, which makes it much easier to root for him. Another thing that impressed me is how seamlessly the film blends practical filmmaking with digital effects. There are plenty of moments where actors are interacting directly with robots, touching them, repairing them, standing next to them, and somehow it rarely feels disconnected. That's harder than it sounds. We've all seen movies where actors clearly look like they're staring at a tennis ball attached to a stick while pretending a giant creature exists in front of them. Real Steel avoids that feeling most of the time. The interactions feel natural. The physical presence feels convincing. The illusion holds together. And honestly, that's one of the biggest compliments I can give the effects team. You stop thinking about the effects. You just accept the robots as part of the world. The motion of the robots deserves credit too. They don't move like superheroes. They move like machines trying to imitate human fighters. There's a subtle difference there. The animators understood that these weren't supposed to be human beings in metal suits. They're robots built for boxing. Their movements feel mechanical without feeling stiff, powerful without feeling weightless. It's a delicate balance, and the movie gets it right more often than not. One thing I noticed on rewatch is how much the visual effects benefit from restraint. The film isn't constantly trying to overwhelm you with impossible camera moves or visual chaos. The camera usually gives the robots enough room to exist inside the frame. You can actually see what's happening. Which sounds obvious, but trust me, not every effects-driven movie remembers that. Sometimes the best way to show off great visual effects is simply to let the audience look at them. And that's exactly what Real Steel does. The robots are allowed to be the stars. They're allowed to occupy the screen. They're allowed to feel real. Looking back now, I think that's one reason the movie has aged as well as it has. The visual effects aren't trying to distract you, they're trying to convince you, and once you're convinced, something interesting happens. The robots stop feeling like special effects. They start feeling like characters. That's a difficult line to cross. A lot of movies try, very few pull it off. Real Steel actually gets there, which is probably why people still remember Adam all these years later. Not because he looked impressive. Plenty of robots look impressive. People remember him because, somehow, the movie made a machine feel alive without ever needing to say that it was. And honestly, that's probably where Sean Levy deserves more credit than he usually gets for this movie. Because when you describe Real Steel to somebody who hasn't seen it, it sounds dangerously close to becoming ridiculous. A washed-up ex-boxer, an estranged son, a discarded robot, a championship dream, a future where giant robots box in arenas. If you read that as a plot summary, it almost feels like 5 different movie ideas fighting each other for screen time. The surprising part is that it mostly works, not perfectly, but far better than it probably should. I think that's one of the biggest achievements of the direction. Levy understands exactly what kind of movie he's making, and more importantly, what kind of movie he's not making. He never treats Real Steel like hard science fiction. He never tries to convince us we're watching some profound meditation on technology or the future of humanity. At the same time, he doesn't treat it like a parody either. That balance is harder to find than people realize. Go too serious, and the premise risks collapsing under its own weight. Go too silly, and none of the emotional moments land. Real Steel spends most of its runtime walking that line, sometimes wobbling a little, but generally staying upright. One thing I noticed on rewatch is how patient the movie is with its setup. That's something I appreciated more the second time around. A lesser version of this film probably rushes straight to Adam and starts throwing robots into arenas as quickly as possible. Real Steel actually takes its time. It introduces Charlie's failures, lets us sit with his bad decisions, builds the tension between him and Max, shows us the state of their lives before Adam enters the picture. At first, I thought some of that material moved a little slowly. Then I realized the movie is quietly laying the foundation for everything that comes later. Without that groundwork, the victories wouldn't mean nearly as much. And that's something Levy generally handles well throughout the film. He's constantly balancing multiple stories at once. There's the sports narrative, the father-son relationship, the redemption arc, the robot spectacle, the coming-of-age elements. On paper, that sounds messy. Yet the movie rarely feels overwhelmed by its own moving parts. Not because every storyline is equally deep, but because the film always knows which one should take priority. Whenever things threaten to become too mechanical, it returns to the characters. Whenever the drama starts becoming too heavy, it brings us back to the robots. The movie keeps shifting its weight, and that rhythm helps it stay engaging. Now, does every emotional moment work? Not necessarily. There are definitely scenes where you can feel the movie reaching for your emotions, sometimes pretty aggressively. A few moments arrive with such confidence that you can almost hear the film saying, "This is where you're supposed to feel inspired." And your reaction to that will probably depend on your tolerance for sentimentality. Some viewers embrace it. Others will roll their eyes. Personally, I found myself somewhere in the middle. There are moments where the movie pushes hard, maybe a little too hard. But there's also enough sincerity underneath those moments that they rarely feel cynical. That's an important distinction. The film genuinely believes in its story. It believes in these characters. It believes in the emotional payoff, even when it's being obvious about it. And honestly, I'd rather watch a movie that occasionally overreaches emotionally than one that's afraid to care about anything. Another thing Levy does well is understanding scale. The movie knows when to go big and when to pull back. One scene might put thousands of screaming fans inside a massive arena. The next might focus entirely on a conversation between Charlie and Max. The shift never feels jarring. In fact, those quieter moments often make the larger scenes feel bigger, because now there's something personal attached to them. The spectacle isn't existing on its own, it's connected to somebody. That's why the final act works as well as it does. Not because the action suddenly becomes better than everything before it, because by then the audience has emotional context. We've spent enough time with these people. We've watched them fail. We've watched them fight. We've watched them change. The action is simply the release valve for everything that's been building underneath. Looking back, I don't think Real Steel succeeds because it's the most original film in the world. It isn't. I don't think it succeeds because it's the smartest science fiction movie ever made. It isn't that either. It succeeds because Sean Levy understands how to package familiar ingredients in a way that feels genuinely entertaining. He knows when to lean into the spectacle. He knows when to step away from it. And most importantly, he never loses sight of the fact that giant robots may get people into the theater, but human stories are what keep them invested once they're there. That's a surprisingly difficult balance to pull off. Real Steel makes it look easier than it probably was. One thing I found interesting about Real Steel is that for a movie filled with giant robots, sold-out arenas, and championship fights, it actually relies quite a bit on its supporting cast to keep everything moving. The funny part is that most of these characters aren't especially complex. They're not the kind of supporting roles that completely steal the movie. But they each serve a purpose, and for the most part, they do that job well enough. Let's start with Bailey, because she's probably the most important supporting character in the film. And honestly, she's one of those characters that could have easily been written as nothing more than a standard love interest archetype. There are definitely moments where the script leans in that direction. You can see the blueprint. The loyal friend, the person who believes in Charlie even when Charlie doesn't deserve it, the emotional support system standing just outside the main conflict. We've all seen versions of this character before, but what helps Bailey is Evangeline Lil. She brings a warmth to the role that keeps the character from feeling completely one-dimensional. More importantly, she gives Charlie somebody who isn't impressed by his excuses, and Charlie desperately needs that. Almost everybody else in the movie either wants something from him or is trying to get away from him. Bailey is one of the few people willing to call him out when he's being an idiot, which, to be fair, happens quite often. I also liked the chemistry between Lily and Hugh Jackman. The movie never makes their relationship the central focus, and that's probably the right decision. It's there, you understand it. Then the film moves on. It doesn't spend half the runtime forcing a romance subplot that nobody came to see. Now, beyond Bailey, the supporting cast is filled with characters who mostly function as pieces of Charlie's world. Promoters, gamblers, fight organizers, creditors, people constantly pulling him deeper into trouble or offering him a chance to climb back out of it. They're not deeply developed, but they help create the feeling that Charlie exists inside a larger ecosystem, a world where everybody is hustling for the next opportunity. Anthony Mackie's character is probably the one I wish had gotten more to do. Every time he shows up, there's this sense that he could become a bigger part of the story. The movie hints at it. Then it quickly moves on. It's not a major issue, but it does feel like there was room to explore that character a little further. And then we get to the antagonists. Or at least, the people occupying the antagonist positions. Because if I'm being completely honest, the villains are probably one of the weaker parts of the film. Not terrible, just very straightforward. You pretty much understand who you're supposed to root against the moment they appear. There isn't much ambiguity. There aren't many layers. They're designed to represent the obstacle standing between Adam and the championship dream. That's their primary function. And in that sense, they do their job. The problem is that they're never quite as interesting as the heroes. You don't spend much time wondering what motivates them. You don't spend much time thinking about their perspective. They're mostly there to create contrast. The powerful versus the powerless. The elite versus the underdog. The champions versus the challengers. It's effective in a broad storytelling sense, but it's not particularly nuanced. Then again, maybe it doesn't need to be. Because when I think back on Real Steel, I rarely think about the villains. I think about Charlie. I think about Max. I think about Adam. That's where the emotional investment lives. The supporting characters are there to strengthen those relationships rather than compete with them. And honestly, that's probably why most of them work. The movie understands what its priorities are. It never loses sight of the central trio. Everybody else exists to support that journey. Some characters leave a bigger impression than others. Some probably deserved a little more depth. A few lean into familiar stereotypes, but none of them become distractions. They're functional without feeling completely forgettable. And in a movie juggling robots, family drama, sports movie cliches, and underdog storytelling all at the same time, that balance is probably more important than it sounds. Not every supporting character needs to dominate the screen. Sometimes they just need to keep the spotlight exactly where it belongs. In Real Steel, that spotlight never really leaves Charlie, Max, and Adam. And ultimately, I think that's the right call. Something I didn't fully appreciate the first time I watched Real Steel is just how much of the movie's success comes from the technical side of filmmaking. Because, let's be honest, a premise like this could have gone wrong in 100 different ways, even if the story worked. Even if the characters worked. If the world didn't feel convincing, or if the fights lacked impact, or if the visual presentation felt cheap, the entire illusion would start falling apart. And surprisingly, that's one area where the movie is much stronger than it often gets credit for. The cinematography, for example, does a lot of heavy lifting. Not in a flashy, look at this incredible camera move kind of way. It's more subtle than that. The movie understands when to make the robot fights feel enormous and when to pull things back into smaller, more personal spaces. One minute you're inside a packed arena with thousands of people screaming for a championship fight. The next you're in a cramped workshop surrounded by spare parts, rusted metal, and characters trying to figure out their next move. That contrast works really well, because the movie constantly shifts between spectacle and intimacy. And visually, it always feels like those two worlds belong together. I also like how the film approaches its version of the future. A lot of science fiction movies make the mistake of trying too hard. Everything becomes futuristic. The buildings, the clothes, the vehicles, the dialogue. Every scene screams, "Look, it's the future!" Real Steel takes a much more restrained approach. Most of the world actually feels recognizable. People still live in houses, they still drive around. They still work jobs and struggle with money and make bad decisions. The future isn't radically different, it's just slightly altered. The technology evolved, everything else mostly followed along. And weirdly enough, that makes the world feel more believable. It feels like a future people could actually end up living in rather than some distant fantasy. The production design deserves a lot of credit for that, especially when it comes to the robots. Not just Adam, all of them. Every machine feels designed for a purpose. The expensive championship robots look different from the underground fighters. The underground fighters look different from training bots. The details matter. You can tell somebody actually thought about how these machines would exist within this world rather than simply designing whatever looked cool. Now let's talk about the sound, because honestly, the sound design might be one of the most underrated parts of the entire film. Every punch lands with weight. Every impact feels heavy. Metal bends, hydraulics strain, mechanical parts groan under pressure. The robots sound like machines under stress rather than cartoon characters smashing into each other. That may not sound like a big deal, but it's a huge reason why the fights feel convincing. Without that sound design, the action would lose half its power. There's something incredibly satisfying about hearing these giant machines collide. The audio sells the scale just as much as the visuals do. And then we get to the score. This is probably the one technical area where reactions seem to vary the most. Some people love it, some people really don't. I can understand both perspectives. There are moments where the music does exactly what it's supposed to do. It gives the story momentum. It elevates emotional scenes. It helps create that crowd-pleasing sports movie atmosphere. But there are also moments where you can feel the film leaning pretty hard into the emotion. Sometimes the music arrives and basically announces, this is an inspirational moment now. And whether that works for you will probably depend on your personal tolerance for sentimental sports drama energy. For me, it mostly worked. Not all the time, but more often than not. What I appreciate is that the technical departments are all pulling in the same direction. Nothing feels disconnected. The visuals support the action supports the story, the sound supports the visuals, the music supports the emotional beats. Everybody seems to understand the assignment, and that's harder to achieve than it sounds. Because we've all seen movies where individual elements are impressive, but never quite come together into a cohesive experience. Real Steel avoids that problem. The craftsmanship isn't trying to call attention to itself, it's trying to support the story. And honestly, that's probably why a lot of people don't immediately notice how much work is happening behind the scenes. When technical filmmaking is doing its job well, it becomes invisible. You stop analyzing it, you stop noticing it, you simply accept the world and get caught up in the experience. That's exactly what happened here. The robots feel real. The arenas feel alive. The fights feel impactful. The emotional moments land more often than they miss. And when you step back and look at everything required to make that happen, you start realizing that Real Steel is a much more carefully constructed movie than its simple premise might initially suggest. It may not be the kind of film people discuss in cinematography classes for decades, but the craftsmanship on display is a huge reason the movie still works all these years later. A lot of films age because their technology ages. Real Steel has managed to avoid that fate, and a big part of the reason is because the people behind the camera knew exactly what kind of experience they were trying to create, and they built every technical element around making that experience feel real. The more I think about Real Steel, the more I realize that the robots were never really the reason people connected with it. They got people through the door, they got people interested, but they weren't the reason the movie stayed with them. Because underneath all the metal, all the punching, all the underdog victories, Real Steel is constantly chasing something much simpler. Connection. That's really what the movie keeps coming back to. Almost every major character is carrying some version of loss, disappointment, or unfinished business. Charlie is trying to escape a life that never turned out the way he imagined. Max is trying to understand a father who was never there. Even Adam, strangely enough, becomes a symbol for things that have been discarded and forgotten. Nobody starts this story from a position of strength. Everybody is missing something. And I think that's why the film's emotional themes work better than they probably should. Because, despite the futuristic setting, the emotions themselves are incredibly familiar. We've all experienced some version of failure. Not necessarily on the scale of Charlie's life falling apart, but disappointment is universal. Dreams don't always happen, plans go wrong, people drift apart, opportunities disappear. Real Steel taps into those feelings more often than people give it credit for. One thing I really appreciate is how the movie treats redemption. A lot of films make redemption look easy. A character realizes they've been wrong, gives a big speech, does one heroic thing, and suddenly everything is fixed. Life doesn't usually work like that. And neither does Charlie's journey. His growth is messy, sometimes frustrating, sometimes slow. There are moments where it feels like he's taking 2 steps forward and 1 step back. That's probably why it feels believable. The movie isn't asking us to believe Charlie becomes a perfect person. It's asking us to believe people can change if they're willing to keep trying. That's a much more relatable idea. And honestly, that theme runs through the entire movie. Keep trying, keep getting back up, keep moving forward. You see it in Charlie, you see it in Max, you definitely see it in Adam. The robot becomes the physical embodiment of persistence. No matter how badly damaged he gets, he keeps standing. No matter how impossible the situation becomes, he keeps fighting. It's the oldest sports movie theme imaginable, but there's a reason those themes survive. People respond to them. We want to believe effort matters. We want to believe resilience matters. Real Steel leans into that belief without any embarrassment. Another theme that quietly sneaks through the movie is belonging, and I don't think I noticed it as much when I first watched the film years ago. Max spends most of the story trying to figure out where he belongs. Charlie is struggling with the fact that he doesn't really belong in this new world anymore. Adam literally doesn't belong among the elite robots he's competing against. Everybody is searching for a place where they fit, a place where they're wanted, a place where they matter. It's a surprisingly emotional thread once you start noticing it, especially because the movie never really spells it out. It just lets the characters chase it. Then there's the theme of belief. And I don't mean belief in a religious or spiritual sense. I mean the simple act of believing in something before there's any evidence you should. Max believes in Adam long before anybody else does. Sometimes to an almost unreasonable degree. Charlie doesn't, at least not initially. He's practical, cynical, focused on reality. Max sees possibility where Charlie sees limitations. And over time, that optimism becomes contagious. It's one of the more interesting emotional dynamics in the movie. Because belief is treated almost like a skill, something powerful enough to change people, not magically, not instantly, but gradually. You start seeing characters become better versions of themselves simply because somebody believed they could. That's a surprisingly hopeful message for a film built around robot boxing. Now, does the movie occasionally push these themes a little hard? Absolutely. There are moments where the emotional intentions are impossible to miss. The music swells, the speeches arrive, the crowd starts cheering. The movie definitely knows when it's trying to inspire you, sometimes subtly, sometimes with the cinematic equivalent of a giant flashing sign. But honestly, I'd rather a movie care too much than not care at all. Even when Real Steel gets sentimental, it feels sincere. That's an important difference. The emotion isn't there because the screenplay thinks it's required. It's there because the movie genuinely believes in these characters. And by the end, whether you're invested in the championship fight or not, those emotional themes become the thing holding everything together. The robots are entertaining. The action is exciting. The visual effects are impressive. But what gives the story its staying power is something much less flashy. It's the idea that people don't have to be defined by their failures, that broken relationships can be repaired, that overlooked things still have value, that getting knocked down isn't the same thing as being defeated. Maybe those ideas aren't groundbreaking. Maybe you've heard them before. But sometimes familiar truths land differently when they're wrapped inside the right story. And somehow, through all the robots and spectacle, Real Steel manages to remind us of them anyway. One thing I've always found interesting about Real Steel is how difficult it is to pinpoint exactly who the movie was made for. Not because it's confusing. Actually, it's the opposite. The movie is so accessible that it ends up reaching several different audiences at the same time. And honestly, I think that's one of the biggest reasons it's still being talked about all these years later, because, depending on when you watched it, you probably connected with a completely different part of the story. If you were younger when the film came out, chances are the robots were the main attraction. Let's be honest, giant machines beating each other up in massive arenas is a pretty easy sell. You don't need a deep understanding of storytelling to enjoy that. You don't need to analyze themes. You don't need to care about character arcs. You just need to watch Adam walk into the ring and hope he wins. For a younger audience, that's often enough. And the movie knows it. It never overcomplicates itself. The goals are clear, the stakes are easy to understand, the heroes are easy to root for. There's a simplicity to the storytelling that makes it extremely approachable. But what's interesting is that a lot of people who loved Real Steel as kids ended up revisiting it years later and discovering an entirely different movie. Because once you're older, the robots stop being the only thing you're paying attention to. Suddenly, Charlie's story hits differently. His failures make more sense. His regrets feel more relatable. His struggle to figure out his life feels a lot more familiar than it probably did when you were 12 years old. The same movie starts speaking to a different audience, and I think that's a sign of a film that understands how to layer its appeal, not in a complicated way, just enough. Then you have sports movie fans. Honestly, this group was probably always going to enjoy Real Steel. Because beneath all the science fiction packaging, this movie speaks the language of sports dramas fluently. The underdog climb, the impossible odds, the training sequences, the comeback moments, the championship dream. Those ingredients have been working for decades because people genuinely enjoy them. Real Steel simply swaps human fighters for robots. The emotional mechanics remain almost identical. And if you're somebody who already loves that type of storytelling, the movie is basically operating on home turf. But then there are viewers who don't usually care about sports films, and strangely enough, some of them connected with it too. Mostly because the emotional focus never stays exclusively on the competition. The fights matter. But relationships matter more. Winning matters. But growth matters more. The movie constantly shifts attention back toward the characters. That broadens its appeal considerably. You're not required to care about boxing. You're not required to care about robots. You just have to care about people trying to improve their lives. That's a much easier emotional entry point. Of course, not everybody responds to it the same way. I've seen plenty of viewers who find the movie too sentimental, too predictable, too eager to crowd please, and honestly, I understand that reaction. Real Steel isn't a challenging film. It isn't trying to provoke difficult conversations. It isn't interested in deconstructing genres or reinventing storytelling. It's trying to entertain. Very openly. Very unapologetically. For some people, that's exactly what they want. For others, it feels too safe. Neither perspective is wrong. What's fascinating, though, is how often the movie seems to work even for people who recognize every cliché coming. Most viewers can predict major story beats well before they happen, yet many of those same viewers still end up emotionally invested. That's not something every crowd pleaser manages to pull off, and I think part of that comes down to sincerity. The film never acts embarrassed by its own optimism. It never apologizes for being heartfelt. It never tries to hide behind irony. There's a confidence in that approach, especially now. A lot of modern blockbusters seem terrified of being too earnest. Every emotional moment gets interrupted by a joke. Every sincere scene gets undercut by sarcasm. Real Steel doesn't really do that. When it wants to be emotional, it's emotional. When it wants to be inspirational, it's inspirational. When it wants the audience to cheer, it goes all in. Sometimes that works better than expected. Sometimes it feels a little heavy-handed. But at least you always know what the movie is trying to do, and audiences tend to respond to that kind of clarity. Looking back, I think the reason Real Steel found such a broad audience is because it offers something slightly different to everyone. Kids get the robots, sports fans get the underdog story, families get the father-son relationship, casual viewers get a straightforward, entertaining adventure, and people revisiting it years later often discover themes they completely missed the first time around. Not every movie can do that. A lot of films appeal to one group while alienating another. Real Steel somehow finds a middle ground. Maybe that's why it is aged better than many people expected. It doesn't demand a specific kind of viewer. It simply invites you into its world and lets you decide which part of the journey matters most to you. And judging by how many people still remember Adam, Charlie, and those robot fights years after the credits rolled, that invitation clearly worked for a lot of people. After spending all this time talking about the story, the characters, the robots, the themes, and everything else, I think the simplest way to understand why Real Steel has remained surprisingly popular is to look at what the movie consistently does well. Because for all its flaws, and we'll get to those later, it has a number of strengths that are difficult to ignore. Some movies have one standout element carrying the entire experience. Real Steel isn't really that kind of film. What makes it work is that several pieces are all performing at a pretty high level at the same time. Nothing has to carry the entire weight by itself. The first and probably most obvious strength is Adam, and honestly, that's not something I expected to say about a robot. If you had explained this movie to me before watching it, I would have assumed Hugh Jackman would be the center of everything. The human drama would be the focus. The robots would just be cool visual effects. Instead, Adam gradually becomes the emotional anchor of the entire story. That's not easy to pull off. We've seen countless movies with giant monsters, robots, aliens, or creatures that look impressive for 2 hours and are forgotten a week later. Adam somehow avoids that fate. People remember him years later, not because he's flashy, not because he's the strongest machine, because the movie successfully turns him into an underdog people genuinely care about. That's a huge achievement. Another major strength is the father-son dynamic. Now, is it the most original relationship ever put on screen? Definitely not. But originality isn't really the point here. What matters is that it works. The emotional progression feels believable enough that, by the end, you're invested in Charlie and Max for reasons that go beyond the robot fights. The movie could have easily treated that relationship as background material. Instead, it becomes one of the central pillars holding the entire story together. And honestly, that's probably why the film appeals to people who don't even care about boxing, or robots, or sports movies in general. The emotional foundation gives audiences something human to connect with. Then there are the fight sequences. Even now, they're incredibly entertaining, not just because they're visually impressive, because they're structured well. The movie understands how to build anticipation, how to create momentum, how to make each victory feel like it matters. You never get the sense that the fights exist simply because the screenplay needs another action scene. Most of them push the story forward. Most of them carry emotional stakes. That makes a huge difference. And of course, we can't talk about strengths without mentioning the visual effects. Honestly, this might be the film's most universally praised element. The robots still look good. Not good for their time, just good. That's a rare compliment for an effects-heavy movie more than a decade old. The combination of practical design, animation, motion capture, and visual effects creates a level of believability that helps the entire film hold together. If the robots looked fake, everything else would suffer. They don't. And because they don't, the audience buys into the story. Another thing I appreciate is the movie's commitment to sincerity. This might sound like a strange thing to praise, but it matters. Real Steel never seems embarrassed by its own emotions. It doesn't constantly stop to make jokes about itself. It doesn't act like it has to apologize for being hopeful or inspirational. It simply commits. Sometimes that leads to moments that are a little cheesy, sure. But I'd argue that's preferable to a movie that's afraid of having any emotional identity at all. The film believes in its story. That confidence becomes part of its appeal. There's also something to be said for how accessible the movie is. Not every film needs to be complicated. Not every story needs layers of ambiguity or endless interpretation. Real Steel knows exactly what experience it's trying to deliver. And for the most part, it succeeds. You don't need specialized knowledge. You don't need to be a science fiction fan. You don't need to be a boxing fan. The movie communicates its goals clearly and invites the audience along for the ride. That's harder than it sounds. Making something broadly appealing without feeling completely generic is a difficult balance. Real Steel gets surprisingly close, and maybe one of its greatest strengths is that it understands entertainment. That sounds obvious, but you'd be surprised how many films lose sight of it. The movie knows when to slow down, knows when to speed up, knows when to focus on character, knows when to deliver spectacle. Even when the story becomes predictable, it rarely becomes boring. That's an important distinction. A film can be familiar and still be engaging. Real Steel proves that repeatedly. Looking back, I don't think people continue revisiting this movie because it's revolutionary. They revisit it because it's enjoyable, because the characters are likable enough, because Adam is memorable, because the action works, because the emotional beats land more often than they miss, because the world feels believable, because the movie delivers exactly the experience it promises. And honestly, there's real value in that. Not every successful film has to redefine cinema. Sometimes a movie's greatest strength is understanding what it wants to be and executing that vision with confidence. Real Steel may not be perfect, but when it comes to delivering heartfelt, crowd-pleasing entertainment, it gets a lot more right than wrong. Now, having spent all this time talking about what Real Steel gets right, I think it's only fair to talk about where the movie doesn't quite reach the same level. Because as much as I enjoy this film, and honestly I do enjoy it quite a bit, it's definitely not one of those movies where every piece fits together perfectly. Some of its biggest strengths are actually connected to some of its biggest weaknesses, and I think that's part of what makes discussions about Real Steel interesting all these years later. Let's start with the most obvious criticism. The story is incredibly predictable, and I don't mean a little predictable. I mean, there are stretches where you can probably guess major developments long before they happen. You know who's going to bond. You know who's going to change. You know which robot the audience is supposed to root for. You know where the championship story is heading. Even the emotional turning points often arrive exactly when you'd expect them to. Now, whether that's a deal breaker depends entirely on the viewer. Some people don't care. Others care a lot. But there's no getting around the fact that Real Steel follows a very familiar path. The movie rarely surprises you. It aims for satisfaction much more than unpredictability. That leads directly into another criticism. The film leans heavily on cliches. Sports movie cliches, family drama cliches, redemption story cliches, underdog story cliches. At times it feels like the screenplay is working through a checklist of storytelling beats that have existed for decades. And to be fair, sometimes it works because those beats are effective. Other times, you can almost feel the machinery underneath the story. You become aware of the formula, not enough to completely break the experience, but enough to notice it. There were definitely moments where I found myself thinking, yeah, I've seen this scene before. Maybe not this exact version, but something very close to it. Then there's the issue of missed opportunities. And honestly, this is probably the criticism I find myself agreeing with the most, because the robot boxing concept is genuinely fascinating. The movie creates a world where advanced machines have completely transformed an entire sport. That's a huge idea, a really huge idea. Yet the film often seems more interested in familiar emotional territory than exploring some of the bigger questions its premise naturally raises. You start wondering about the technology, about society, about how these machines changed people's lives, about the relationship between humans and increasingly advanced robotics. The movie touches some of those ideas, then moves on. It's not that those themes are ignored. It's more that they're never explored as deeply as they could have been. And every now and then, I found myself wishing the film had been a little more ambitious in that area. Not necessarily smarter, just more curious, because the world feels rich enough to support it. The same thing happens with Adam. One of the most intriguing aspects of the movie is the question of whether Adam is developing something that resembles personality or awareness. The film repeatedly hints at it, just enough to make you think about it. Then it refuses to commit. Part of me appreciates the mystery. Part of me thinks there was a potentially fascinating story hidden there that never fully emerges. It's one of those ideas that stays lingering in the background, not unfinished exactly, just underexplored. The supporting characters are another area where the film occasionally feels a little thin. Bailey is likable, the supporting cast is functional, the antagonists serve their purpose, but very few secondary characters develop beyond their narrative role. Most of them exist to support Charlie, Max, and Adam's journey, which is understandable, but it does leave portions of the world feeling less layered than they could have been. And honestly, the villains are probably the clearest example of that. They're obstacles, effective obstacles, but mostly just obstacles. You never spend much time understanding them. You never feel particularly conflicted about them. The movie isn't interested in complexity there. It's interested in momentum, which works for entertainment but limits some of the dramatic depth. Then there's the sentimentality. And this one is probably going to come down to personal taste more than anything else. There are moments where Real Steel pushes pretty hard emotionally. The music swells. The speeches arrive. The inspirational beats hit exactly when they're supposed to. Sometimes it works beautifully. Other times it feels like the movie is trying just a little too hard to make sure you're feeling the right emotion at the right moment. I wouldn't call it manipulative, but I would call it obvious. And for some viewers, that level of emotional directness can be a little much. The movie wears its heart on its sleeve, which is admirable, but occasionally it forgets that subtlety can be powerful too. There are also a few plot developments that require a certain amount of generosity from the audience. Not because they're impossible, just because they're extremely convenient. The underdog rise occasionally moves faster than reality would allow. Certain opportunities appear at exactly the right moment. A few victories rely more on emotional logic than practical logic. Again, that's pretty common for sports dramas, but it's still noticeable if you're paying attention. The funny thing is, none of these weaknesses completely undermine the movie. At least not for me. They're real flaws, absolutely, but they tend to exist alongside strengths that compensate for them. The predictability is balanced by emotional investment. The cliches are balanced by sincerity. The missed opportunities are balanced by strong execution. The sentimentality is balanced by genuine heart, which leaves Real Steel in an interesting position. It's not a flawless film. It's not a groundbreaking film. It's not even the most original film. But its weaknesses often feel less like fatal problems and more like the trade-offs the movie makes in order to remain accessible, emotional, and crowd-pleasing. Whether those trade-offs work for you is ultimately a matter of taste, but they're definitely part of the conversation, and honestly, they're part of what makes Real Steel such an interesting movie to revisit. Because even when you can clearly see its flaws, it's surprisingly difficult not to understand why so many people connected with it anyway. So after everything, the robot fights, the father-son story, the underdog journey, the visual spectacle, the strengths, the flaws, where does that leave Real Steel? Honestly, in a pretty interesting place. Because this is one of those movies that feels different depending on when you watch it. I think that's partly why it has managed to stick around for so long. When it first came out, a lot of people looked at it as a fun blockbuster with a slightly ridiculous premise. Giant boxing robots sounded like the kind of idea that would either become a guilty pleasure or disappear from people's memories within a few years. Instead, something unexpected happened. People kept coming back to it, and not just out of nostalgia. Every few years, you'll see someone revisit Real Steel and have almost the exact same reaction. Wait, this movie is actually better than I remember. I've seen that response countless times, and I think I understand why. Because the movie succeeds in an area where a lot of big-budget entertainment struggles. It gives people something to care about. That sounds simple, but it really isn't. Spectacle alone rarely lasts. Technology evolves. Visual effects improve. Action scenes become bigger. Every year, there's another blockbuster promising more scale, more destruction, more intensity. Yet somehow, people still remember Adam. That's not because he was the most advanced visual effect ever created. It's because the movie turned him into an emotional investment. The same thing applies to Charlie and Max. Their relationship isn't revolutionary. Their story isn't particularly unpredictable. But it feels sincere. And sincerity has a strange way of aging well, especially when a movie fully commits to it. Now, is Real Steel a masterpiece? No. I don't think it is. The story is too familiar for that. The film leaves too many interesting ideas unexplored. Some characters deserved more development, some emotional beats are a little too obvious, and if you're looking for groundbreaking science fiction, you'll probably leave disappointed. Those criticisms are fair, they're real, but at the same time, I don't think those criticisms tell the whole story, because movies aren't judged solely by what they could have been, they're judged by what they are. And what Real Steel is, at its core, is a remarkably effective piece of entertainment. It's a movie that understands its audience. It knows when to make you laugh. It knows when to build tension. It knows when to slow down. It knows when to let the robots take over. Most importantly, it knows when to focus on the people. That's why the emotional moments land. That's why the fights matter. That's why the ending works. Not because the movie is doing something nobody has ever done before, because it executes familiar ideas with confidence. And sometimes that's enough. Actually, sometimes that's more than enough. Looking back now, I think the biggest compliment I can give Real Steel is that it never becomes cynical, not once, even when it follows predictable paths, even when it embraces sports movie cliches, even when it's reaching for emotional payoffs you can see coming from miles away. The film genuinely believes in its own optimism. It believes people can change. It believes broken relationships can heal. It believes underdogs deserve a chance. It believes persistence matters. Maybe those ideas are simple, maybe they're even old-fashioned, but there's something refreshing about a movie that's willing to embrace them without irony, and I think audiences felt that. That's why Real Steel continues finding new viewers. That's why people who watched it as kids often revisit it as adults. That's why Adam remains one of the most memorable movie robots of the last couple of decades. Not because the movie is perfect, because it has heart, real heart, the kind that's difficult to fake. At the end of the day, Real Steel isn't really a movie about robots. It isn't really a movie about technology. And it isn't even really a movie about boxing. It's a movie about second chances. Second chances for a father. Second chances for a son.